Hello everyone, I'm Shahzeb Usman and welcome you to our conversation. Today we will be discussing human rights, global politics and international law. We are very happy to have Ms. Shahzad Amin.
Hi.
Ms. Shahzad Amin is a lawyer and who did an undergraduate degree from SOAS in London and has an LLM degree from UC Berkeley. She has worked in defamation litigation, the death penalty and criminal law, as well as cybercrime. She is currently the legal advisor mandated by UNICEF to the National Commission on Rights of Children. Previously, she was also a research fellow at the Center of Excellence of International Law at ISRA NDU. Hello, Shahzad. How are you?
Thank you. It's such a pleasure being here.
Pleasure to have you too. So, if we talk about human rights, what do you mean by human rights? What is the general term? Are they inherent or bestowed upon us? Do somebody gives it to us, or we have it just by virtue of being born?
So I would say I think the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, which was kind of passed by the General Assembly of the United Nations in 1948, Article 1 of that kind of encapsulates what human rights essentially are, which is that we all are born equal and free in dignity and in rights. Now, whether those are inherent or bestowed has been such a debate for centuries, actually. And I think they're inherent because human rights kind of existed before the codification of international law. And they existed throughout different religions, cultures, different time periods. But their actual codification, I think, post the United Nations actually coming into being is when it happened. So even now, when you look at human rights, you think of international law, you think of the ICCPR, which is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. That, along with the UDHR and with the International Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, all of that comes together to create your Bill of Rights. So that is actually your main document that you look at when you're talking about human rights. Again, like I said, codification is recent. It's been bestowed upon us, but essentially I think they are inherent. You find that in diverse religions also, this kind of this idea of dignity that has always existed. But of course, I think norms is an ongoing process. It's evolutionary. So codifying those norms into actual law is what is bestowed upon us.
Very interesting. So you're basically saying that we have it by virtue of being born.
Yes.
But we need some charter. We need some
Of course.
legal document that can make it justiciable.
Exactly, because also we're living in a world which is now kind of like a global community, and there's so much interstate and inter-individual collaboration and kind of, you know, relationship. So it's really important to have these this codified law, this document that not only can be referred to, but if, for example, there's a violation of any kind, you can be held accountable for.
Fair enough, fair enough. But don't you think, like, a lot of people say that, you know, if you ask anybody in Pakistan, a common man in the city, he will say or she will say that, you know, it's a very Western concept. It is something coming from the West, and whoever is codifying it will also have their own way. And since West has primarily leading the codification, so do you find human rights a Western construct imposed on other cultures?
I wouldn't say that it is a Western concept. With regards to Pakistan itself, I think the process of codification has kind of made it this foreign entity. It itself is essentially by the mere existence of us being on this planet that provides us with human rights. I think the codification process, because it went through the United Nations, which itself is seen as this foreign entity, especially in Pakistan, especially, honestly speaking, in Asia towards the East, it is seen as a foreign entity. If we look at it, it essentially, the history of the United Nations is that it came into existence because the West triumphed over Germany. So the fact that they codified it makes it a Western concept, but it isn't essentially. There's so many rights. For example, the right to inheritance, which is, I wouldn't say a primary human right, it's a tertiary human right, but even that existed in religion, in culture, way before the codification of any international law.
So you think it is something which has some imprint of Western civilization, as with everything?
Yes, of course.
Because we are living in a Western world. Economic system has it, cultural system has it. So human rights are not separate from that Western imprint, but it is still, you cannot just make a slanting statement that this is a Western thing.
Of course. And there's so many human rights which, honestly speaking, were part of Eastern culture, just codified by the West. And then, of course, as in a lot of matters, the West then took primary charge of that.
Fair enough, I understand. So I'll come now to your like area of expertise. You have done, I think, LLM in technology law, very
Yes.
rare. A lot, I don't know a lot of people have done that. But how do you see the dominance of Western-owned technology platform? We have seen that Twitter has been used to, you know, let's say misrepresent. A lot of times
Of
we see
course.
that it has been used as a propaganda tool. So how do you see the Western-owned technology platforms influence the global conversation on human rights? Do you see the link between this technology and the general discourse that has been propagated on human rights?
Definitely. So I believe I'm forgetting the year, I apologize, but there was an Amnesty report which talked about how Western tech companies were kind of propagating this already prevalent systemic discrimination against vulnerable and marginalized groups. And that isn't just within a state, but outside, between states also, and on a global level as well. I believe it was just May 2024 when 200 employees of Meta signed an open letter to Mark Zuckerberg asking why there was alleged, censorship of the Palestine issue.
Yeah, yeah.
So, of course, that exists. But to be fair, I would argue the other side as well that every tech platform, every actually media outlet has a certain agenda or certain objectives and outcomes, right? To be able to meet those objectives, they are pushing for a certain narrative. And when pushing for that narrative, it means going against another narrative. So all media outlets, all tech platforms, whether that be Meta, whether that be Twitter, whether that be anything, yes, they shouldn't be engaging actively in stuff like shadow banning, but are they pushing a certain narrative forward? Of course, that is their primary objective. Where a media outlet, if you take any media outlet, take a local media outlet, it's never going to report both sides of a story. It's going to report one side of the story. That is building its own narrative. So I think, yes, it does influence human rights to quite a degree, but is there essentially anything we can do other than huge systemic change, like huge systematic change? I don't think so, because this kind of discrimination and this kind of narrative building mechanism exists on a like primary grassroots level. It has always existed.
So, like for example, like we have seen Twitter especially and other, especially with the Gaza thing, I think it's been very evident
Of course.
that there is gross violations of human rights happening in Gaza.
Yes.
Everybody knows it, but and these platforms, the hallmark of these platforms were that like they were new media, and they said that the old media is bad,
Yes.
and it is propagation, it is whoever is funding it is it propagating that narrative, and we are this like bastion of freedom of speech.
Yeah.
But don't you think that this particular event has just obliterated that kind of image?
I
of
think
them?
you're absolutely right, Shahzeb. I think basically people thought that they could use social media
Yeah.
or tech platforms to kind of get that voice of marginalized groups out. And essentially, in the beginning, that was what they kind of put out there, that you
Yeah.
can use social media or this new media to talk about issues that were never talked about in mainstream media.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think for their own survival, and of course, this is no kind of excuse. I
Yeah, yeah.
completely do not think that one's own survival should take precedent over human rights. But thinking from their perspective, I think for their own survival, they decided that it's better to propagate a narrative that already exists, which will strengthen them, which is wrong because, for example, the people of Gaza, they only have social media and these outlets to put their voices out there. If there was no social media, no tech platforms, they would be reliant on mainstream media, which would obviously, as we've seen in the past with any such conflict, other than certain conflicts which are more palatable to the West, with all such conflicts, they propagate a certain narrative and they never get the other side. Even in, let's say, the war on terrorism, there was a certain narrative that was put across. We never got to hear the other side until actual reports came out, UN special rapporteurs went in, and then, of course, with the emergence of social media. But you can see that distinction because in 2001, you didn't have social media heading, media outlets or having such, breaking news as it does now. So I think that kind of shows the distinction.
Yeah, so you're basically saying that these do influence the global
Of
conversations, but we cannot trust them completely now.
We cannot.
They
I
have a
think,
political
yeah,
agenda.
definitely all of them have their own narrative building mechanisms.
Well, that is sad because
Yeah.
we were under the impression that these organizations will provide us that kind of voice, the
Yes.
democratization that we were talking about. Because the people who go on television, they're not, they're mostly privileged people who are
Of course.
called.
Of
right?
course.
But these were the platform where everybody can speak, and we have seen that it has been stifled out, and which is kind of
I
very
think it's
sad. Yeah.
part of a bigger problem, very honestly speaking. Like, essentially, and without getting too much, getting too controversial, essentially, all of these platforms also have their own funding, their own
Yeah.
setup, their own mechanism to be able to survive. They've decided that pushing a certain narrative is the only way forward, which is very sad. It talks about a larger issue of our human rights. It talks about a larger issue of our economic and systemic issues globally. But what can one do?
And again, most of these organizations are making revenue out of advertisements.
Of course.
And again, the biggest entities that are giving these advertisements are corporations.
Yes.
And again, they are basically based in Western market.
Of course.
So I think it's all about money at the end of the day.
Of
I always say
course
it's
it is.
capitalism.
Of course, in a capitalist global
Yeah.
system, this is one of the major drawbacks.
Yeah.
There's so many others.
Yeah. Uh, Talking about capitalism, how do you think that, for example, these economic disparities
Yes.
and political power imbalances, a lot of people say that, okay, we have this right to vote under the human rights too, but if we don't have our own food and our own home, our vote will be, this is not our vote, this is anybody who's funding our vote.
Yes.
And that we've seen in the feudal system a lot. Like, so I think that, for example, how do you see these economic disparities being played into these human rights discourse? There is ICESCR, to International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, but that is, I feel, given less importance in the discourse as compared to ICCPR.
Yes.
And then we also saw with the GSP Plus project, if you've seen that it is a economic thing. We have given this preferential market in EU, but it is tied to these human rights obligations. Even they asked us to ratify ICC statute and then ICCPR optional protocols, and they are making these economic things, economic carrots, linked with political objectives. So how do you see the link of it, the economic system and human rights?
So I think, I believe in the year 2030, we have some sustainable development goals we have to reach. And one of them, which is, I believe, goal 10, it talks about the fact that you need to strengthen your human rights to be able to economically prosper. Now, that's a very overarching goal, in all honesty. But I think to be able to understand why human rights usually take a backseat and and there's so much importance given to economics is because of the state you're in. So, for example, in Pakistan, there's so much economic disparity. Basic survival is key, and like you said, at the end of the day, it's about whether you can get whether you can get food home or not. So human rights are thought of as a privilege, which they shouldn't be, because if and there's another goal, I believe, in the Sustainable Development Goals that is mentioned, Goal 16, which talks about how you should have human rights centric development and planning and development policies within a state. But how can you essentially have those? Because to be able to have those, you have to get funding from somewhere. Like you mentioned, GSP Plus. With that, the things that are tied with GSP Plus are all human rights centric, but are they actually grassroots centric? They're not. No. They're usually that you have to make state reports, you have to give certain reporting commissions, for example, or certain ministries have to fulfill certain criteria or goals. For example, you'll always have a minority candidate in a commission or a ministry. As long as you sustain that, it doesn't matter where he's from, it doesn't matter he or she, if they're from a privileged background or not, where they went to school, etc. None of that matters as long as you fulfill that criteria so you can reach your economic goal. Which kind of takes away from, again, I keep using the word grassroots because it's so something that essentially is never going to develop in most states, because you kind of invest in your grassroots level, even in politics, in grassroots level student organizations. You not only set up those people, but you set up the people behind them, and because they have the kind of mindset where they actually want to develop your human rights systems, so that is what you actually invest in. But by having such externalities such as GSP Plus, such as so much importance given to ICCPR, then you kind of take away from that, and you're just so caught up in the cycle of, fulfilling criteria, fulfilling goals. You're not actually investing in human rights.
Yeah. And I think that is, we were discussing, I think, before this podcast, that this is a problem with the development sector in itself,
Yes,
right?
of course.
They're fulfilling these like TORs and whatever.
Yes.
And actually, it is not grassrooted enough.
Of course not. And it's not going to essentially help the state per se, because you could have, like, for example, I was reading Goal 16 actually a couple of days ago, and that said that, oh, by having economic disparity, you are not investing in the justice system, or you're not, and you're giving into political pressure. Of course, if you have economic disparity, you're not going to invest in things like planning and development, or you're not going to invest in the justice system, you're not going to invest in even your minority or vulnerable groups in society. You're going to try and invest in the things which you consider are needed for survival. So that's, for example, the food department. But everything else is seen as a privilege, which is ridiculous, very honestly speaking. So to be able to actually inculcate human rights and not have economic disparity, you'd have to have an extreme, I think, structural change as to how the state is run, essentially. You'd have to completely maybe even think about isolating for a bit and coming up with the kind of system that would actually benefit the state.
You're talking about
it's very controversial what I'm saying. But
I do agree with that. That's like I was driving from Lahore to Islamabad yesterday, and my friend, he was from World Bank, and he was like, I was saying, let's go to this isolationist policy, and he was like, what you're proposing is like, you know,
revolutionary.
It will take 50 years, and he'll say like probably this will be a class war. And probably you will also be killed in that.
I feel like people become, like, again, I feel in, of course, within our state, sometimes people, because there's such a lack of trust in the systems, they start just caring about how they are supposed to survive, which essentially makes sense. When you have a loss of trust in systems within your state, then you do become individualistic, which is, again, which actually counters your larger objective of sustaining human rights, because that's like a global and kind of, that has nothing to do with the, it does have to do with the individual, but it's about the larger picture.
Yeah, and like all of us are like trapped in this corporate rat race.
Yes,
like,
of course.
We are privileged enough that we don't have to worry at least about basic survival, and but we want like career progression and everything. And in that tunnel, we get so bogged down that we think that a lot of people are, in fact, majority of the world is caring about these very basic things. And but I do agree with you that probably the protectionist, isolationist, Chinese kind of policies are important if we want to build our own industry.
Of course.
And maybe then open up when our industries can compete. I always say I'm not against opening up, but we in this sector, like what we are having right now, our industry is nascent. If we open up right now, we'll destroy ourselves. We have done that. Of course,
and we have done that, yes.
And we are not sustainable, like our self-sufficiency is not there. If we do any geostrategic policy change, economically they can, as they are doing in case of IMF, they can just push down us. So that's very interesting, and I like how you are connecting human rights with these economic theories. And so do you find, like my last question is basically about this, that do you find that this human rights jargon, this language, has been used to, let's say, push geopolitical interests of the West? We saw that very famous example in Afghanistan, that, you know, they used this human rights discourse, liberate women, and then invaded the country, and they destroyed that country, Iraq, Libya, all these Muslim countries. And they don't really think about the cultural relativism factor in this, and it's like the jargon has been used a lot by the Western countries for their own political interests. And if a common man thinks that human rights are a bad thing, they have a reason, but it has been misused.
Of course.
So what do you think about it?
So I feel this is going to be a very controversial statement again, but essentially, I remember growing up, I had never heard the word collateral damage till, of course, the war on terror happened. And the fact that on one side you're invading, you're breaching sovereignty of a state to protect human rights, and on the other hand, you have a term come into international, not international law, but on the international forum, such as collateral damage, to describe the lives of humans lost when you could carry out a strategic, you know, strategic attack, is just unbelievable, because they're such polar opposites. you're trying to uplift human beings. You're trying to essentially not just that they survive, but they get the kind of rights and the dignity that should be given to all human beings. But at the same time, there's so much loss of lives because you're just trying to carry out short-term strategic goals. And also, the odd thing, at least I find is, and I could be wrong, is that these short-term strategic goals usually are not for a threat that is existing at that point in time, but for, let's say, a past threat or a threat in the future. The fact
that is in mind.
Exactly. The fact that you have this whole debate around Article 51 of Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter, that you can have preemptive strike because there may be a security threat, is just unbelievable. Because that preemptive strike, very honestly speaking, at least from what we can tell from history, it isn't just preemptive strike where you're taking out one individual. There is collateral damage always. So the fact that those lives don't matter and some do matter kind of brings about the debate about how human rights itself is a privilege and on what grounds it is a privilege, because you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights saying that there should be no discrimination on ethnicity, religion, race, but at the same time there is everyday discrimination on those things. So I think more essentially, as a state policy, it's great to have these international covenants. I completely believe that international law is very relevant, especially in today's age. But having interstate and intrastate perspective when it comes to actually upholding human rights, and the state kind of putting itself first, I don't mean it in that way, but putting its citizens first. I get we're a global community, but it is essentially at the end of the day a state's responsibility to protect its citizens, no matter how many global or international covenants it has signed. The reason why states exist is because, I mean, the social contract, you have Rousseau's theory that your sovereign is supposed to look after your rights, is supposed to safeguard your rights. If it's on an individualistic level where you're supposed to safeguard your own rights, then when will any individual have trust in any system, any state, any sovereign? So,
I do agree, and I think I find this very interesting. One thing about generally about human nature, like I see very kind people, even when they are put in this professional capacity, whether they're in the military or in law or whatever, like we become something different.
Of course,
and like the professional, like say the idea of work, the professional competence and all that, in that guise to get the work done, we don't think about something very basic like probably there will be collateral damage, people will be dying. Or as lawyers, you know what they do. So I find that very interesting how this idea of professionalism, this idea of like this is personal and this is professional, and when you're in a professional hat, humanity is not important.
There's a whole debate actually. So I'm cutting you. There's a whole debate about how people have, and I believe it's a sociology debate, but people have these spheres. You have the personal and you have the private, and they do intersect at times, but people also tend to even have different personalities and outlooks when it comes to that. Professionally, they could have, for example, a trajectory where they've planned the next 5-10 years of their life, but if you ask them on a personal level, they'll be like, we're willing to give it all up as long as we can sustain a certain lifestyle. So that then comes down to, I guess, human psychology. Are all these career goals just so that we're able to sustain ourselves? If that's so, then there's such a different world one can envision.
Yeah, and one thing I find very fascinating is that how people become this professionally, they become tunnel visioned.
Yes.
Like, okay, we have to achieve this, we have to do this strike, or we have to win this case, or we have to get this research product out. And in that capacity, we become totally inhumane.
Of course.
And somehow that our humanity is reserved for our private sphere. But work is sustaining the capitalism.
Exactly.
There is not that big distinction in my opinion.
Okay.
And it cannot be. Like, our work is political in its very nature, and it will remain a part of the system. So if we are doing such stuff in a professional capacity and we're just saying it's okay because it's professional, I don't buy that.
It does. I do agree with you to a certain extent. Some people are able to make that distinction, but over time, that distinction does get blurred. So there are certain characteristics you may take upon yourself when you're in a professional environment, and you may be like, this won't matter. Like, for example, even someone who carries out these military strikes may be like, oh, this is my professional life. I'm carrying these out. These, for example, for lack of a better phrase, these lives don't matter to me because I'm upholding the security of my state. But in a personal capacity, they may not believe that. And that intersection at some time will get blurred and it will affect them on a basic level.
Yeah, but again, I blame capitalism for that, creating
Yes.
this very institutional frameworks upon us, which I think are very inherently exploitative, and we become part of it.
I agree,
And
yes.
despite not we are thinking about it, we become so ingrained, we become so, I would say, systemized in it that at the end of the day, what matters is what is the result.
Of
And the
course.
result is that it is not working.
Of course. I genuinely believe that we should invest all this economic and honestly time and resources in actually coming up with a better system. I know people argue against it or they say that other systems have tried, but A, those systems were not given the same time capitalism was given, nor the resources, nor actually even the push. If those were given, who knows how those systems might have prospered.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think at the end of the day, what matters is like, are you giving power to those people who don't have it? I think
Yeah.
like the concept like this, came, we can do this charity, we're giving this rights and whatever. I think it doesn't matter as long as the people are not themselves have a stake in the system. We have to
Of
develop a system
course.
where everybody has some
Yes.
stake. And that comes to the universal right to work.
Yeah.
And empowering everybody that they have a leverage. And then the voice
Of course.
automatically comes. I think this charity and all of that, it's a bandage. It's
Of
good, we
course,
should
of
do it,
course.
but it is not going to solve anything.
Of course, and especially in Pakistan, I feel the reason this state honestly has sustained for so long is because of the private individual. But to be able to make that next level step, you will have to have the government and all these other organizations and stakeholders play their part instead of just relying on the private individual.
Yeah, I agree with you. Well, thank you so much. It was
Thank
a
you,
wonderful
Suman.
conversation,
No, it was
and thank you so
wonderful,
much for taking time out from your busy schedule.
Thank
And
you.
we really enjoyed our conversation here
I
at U3.
definitely. Thank you.